So everybody just loves coffee, but there's some health consequences to do with coffee that you might never have considered. I've had a lot of patients of mine that are surprised when I point out that certain aspects of disorders they're suffering with may actually be partly responsible from their coffee. All right, so number one, and this is a very common thing that I see in my practice that people don't realize coffee may be responsible for, is anxiety. All right, so caffeine, the active principle of coffee, is a stimulant. So given in excessive amounts, it can cause things like jitteriness, feeling shaky, hands trembling. And this is something that I've commonly seen in practice in people who are heavy caffeine consumption users. So if you suffer with anxiety, you might want to consider cutting back on your brew. The next one is also very common, is insomnia. Again, that shouldn't come as much of a surprise. Caffeine is a stimulant. In terms of insomnia, it can range from things like difficulty falling asleep to difficulty maintaining sleep, where you toss and turn through the night. Now, another thing that a lot of patients of mine don't realize with coffee, caffeine, and insomnia is that a cup of coffee has a half-life of about 4 hours. So that means that if you take it, say, at 6 p.m., at 10 p.m., when you're ready to lay your head down and start having a sleep, there's still half of that cup of coffee floating around in your bloodstream, keeping you awake. So one of the things I'll tell my patients suffering with insomnia, where it's very suspicious to me that it might be related to caffeine because of the amount that they're drinking, and also they're drinking it at supper time or throughout the day, is I'll tell them, don't drink it after about supper time, because it's gonna still be there in your bloodstream when you lie down to sleep. Another consequence of the insomnia is you can get into a vicious cycle where you wake up tired because you didn't get enough sleep. You go get a coffee, which then whips you. Then you don't sleep well the next night. And then you just keep repeating that cycle. And then eventually that leads to chronic fatigue and then emotional disturbances and disorders. All right, so next up, again, really common, is increases in heart rate and blood pressure. So heart rate and blood pressure. Heart rate or pulse and blood pressure. Now, what you have to remember, again, because it's a stimulant, it makes your heart contract harder and faster. So it increases the pump. And it can do that for at least 4 hours, which is about its half-life with each cup. In terms of the blood pressure, it can increase it by up to 15 millimeters of mercury. So that might be fine if you're young and fit and your blood pressure is, 120/80. But if you're, say, 140/80, that might then push you up into the 150s, which is not good in a sustained manner. All right, next up is some side effects pertaining specifically to females. And one important one is in pregnant females. Caffeine has been shown to cause low birth weight. And in fact, in one study, for every 100 milligrams of caffeine, that led to a decrease of 13% body weight. That's pretty significant. And just for reference, a single cup of coffee is roughly 100 milligrams of caffeine. So if you're pregnant, that's one reason you might not want to be on a heavy dose of caffeine. The next thing is some studies have shown that there's an increased risk of miscarriage. So this little fella, coming out too early, miscarriages. Another problem with excessive caffeine in females again is breast pain in a condition called fibrocystic disease. So if you're suffering with a lot of cyclical breast pain, you might want to think about cutting back on your caffeine consumption. All right, next up is, and this is actually the reason I personally quit taking coffee on a regular basis, was headaches. So with headaches, we're talking both tension headaches and migraines, and even cluster headaches. Now, with the headaches, there's two different phenomena. There's right after drinking it or soon afterwards, and then there's also withdrawal type headaches where you haven't drank enough coffee fast enough that your body is expecting, and that throws you a headache. Now, another side effect, which isn't really a health consequence but worth mentioning, is the cost. If you were buying one Cafe Americano per day at $3.95, which is an average price, and you consider that there's 260 work days in a year, that means that across 1 year, if you're doing that every day for work, you're spending over $1,000 a year. And over 10 years, that's $10,000. And it's not just the savings lost, it's also that money, if you had put it into some kind of an investment vehicle, could be worth a significant amount to you in your youth, which could be put towards things like paying off your student loans or buying your first house. So there's a cost effect to buying commercial coffee as well. If you're going to do it, brew it yourself. Save money. All right, another side effect a lot of people aren't aware of is dehydration. Now, as a consequence of the dehydration, because caffeine is a diuretic, there's 3 important consequences to that. One is if you are prone to a condition called overactive bladder disorder, where you're constantly peeing, you're going to find that you get more of that if you're a heavy caffeine consumer. The next is something called osteoporosis, or thin bones. Now, that's an effect that's anticipated over decades of exposure to heavy amounts of coffee. As a diuretic, it tends to leach and carry calcium out of your body, robbing it from your bones. And another consequence of heavy caffeine consumption with dehydration is fainting or feeling faint. So say you see a soldier collapsing at a display in a parade, you immediately think, oh, it's because of the heat that he's dehydrated. But many people don't think to ask, well, how many cups of coffee did he have that morning? Another example might be somebody who works as a roofer and they're outdoors in the hot sun. They get dehydrated, they pass out or get heat exhaustion. And then the final one that's worth mentioning is dietary distortions. Now, what do I mean by that? There's 2. The first one is you have to remember that very often in coffee, we pour a lot of adulterants. So a bunch of cream, which here locally we call it double-double. So a whole bunch of cream, whole bunch of syrup, corn syrup, sugar, honey, etc. So I'll call that a form of like gluttony. It's not really, but if you're trying to cut down on fats or sugars, you might be getting them sneaked into your diet through your coffee, especially if you're drinking multiple rounds of coffee during a day. All those creams, they add up. The next really common one that I often see is problems with heartburn, and I've experienced this myself, or GERD, or gastroesophageal reflux disease. If you suffer with this condition, you will tend to get more of it when you take coffee. If you taste coffee when it's black, you realize it's very astringent. It's not particularly pleasant when it rubs up against your stomach walls. It's a secretagogue, so it makes your stomach squirt out more acid, and it also relaxes the sphincter at the top of your stomach that's supposed to keep the acid under your diaphragm. If that sphincter relaxes, it shoots up your swallow pipe up into your mouth. Ooh. So guys, I'm not saying that coffee is completely evil. There's a lot of good stuff about it too. It gets you motivated to turn in that term paper, do your taxes, gets you motivated to do stuff you wouldn't otherwise feel like doing. Gets you out of bed, makes you productive. In general, you should limit yourself to just 4 cups of coffee per day. But in my patient population, when I see that they're experiencing some of these effects, I typically will tell them to limit their coffee to just 2 cups per day and not to take it past supper, because that's going to screw up your sleep. So coffee has its place, but in moderation. I hope this episode helps, and you're welcome.